Okay, so welcome to this session on economics of robotic milking. So I'm Dr. Larry Tranel. I'm a dairy field specialist in Northeast and Southeast Iowa. Been working with robotic milking for actually since they first came into Iowa, and actually worked with the first one that actually came onto the Earhart farm. That's actually pictured here. So when we take a look at robots, we've did some surveys in both 2012 and 2017, and they both came back 100% of people agreed that the robot's been a good financial investment for them. It's improved some cow health, labor efficiency, milk production, been a good personal investment. Okay, so sometimes there's some questions about the labor flexibility, this and that, but also been a good management investment, taking better care of their cows. And it's all been also been a good overall investment. So just realize we did not survey those that actually sold the robots. So we realized that there were some that were actually not very happy with them as well. So this is a herd in Spain that I'd just like to mention is that, sometimes when you're putting in robots, I'd really like to encourage you to think about where you're at in your dairy career. So if you're 5 to 7 years left in your dairy career, robots might not be an option. But when you take a look at having a career that might be 13 to 15 years, they might actually fit in quite well to actually get you to the end of the career. But this herd in Spain just made a comment to me, if I would have just put some kind of a nice milking system in, I wouldn't be faced with this multi-million-dollar decision again, because that parlor would have lasted me 20 years versus what this one did about 13 years in. So when we evaluate robots financially, people think 80 million different things in their mind. Okay, so some people are thinking about cash flow. Some people are thinking about profitability. We need to think about both of those, but a lot of farmers are thinking about their Schedule Fs and how it's going to impact this part of the family or that part of the finances. Okay, so when you take a look at cash flow ability, for somebody that's putting in 2 or 3 robots, just as an example, I've seen this thing go from a negative 50,000 to actually a positive 20,000 in cash flow. But one thing about the robots is that you're actually buying your labor for the next 15 years, and you've got to pay for it in 7. Okay, so that creates kind of a cash flow issue and changes that cash flow ability. So net financial impact, I would actually correlate that to our profitability. I've seen that go from a negative 35, 40,000 to a positive 35 or 40,000. Quality of life, people are putting that all over the board about what it's worth to them to not have to get up at a certain point in time. So when you take a look at cash flow versus net financial impact or profitability and the quality of life, I mean, we could have a $50,000 to $75,000 run negatively. We can also have that run positively, but it usually doesn't run quite that positively on the positive side. So what's the robot being compared to? So if you're going to compare your robot to a very outdated stall barn milking system or a very outdated parlor, I can almost guarantee that robot's going to pan out for you financially, both cash flow wise, I suspect, especially profitability wise. Okay, but if you're comparing it to a nice, well efficient, low cost parlor or some kind of a milking parlor that's milking 70, 80, 90 cows per hour per person, okay, the robot's probably going to have a difficult time beating that system. Okay, but there may be some other reasons why you still want to go with the robots. So we're going to go through an economic of a partial budget of robotic milking just to kind of give you a feel for what's going on. So as a user, this is a spreadsheet that's available for us to work with you. You take a look at your herd size and then just walk down through here with the mailbox price, the estimated cost with the robot, and those things are actually changing, actually coming down a little bit. The milking system in repair, so anything that's got a yellow box to it is just something to be kind of cautious about, because we've got robots out there that are getting $3,000 to $6,000 worth of repair per year, and we've got other ones that are probably in that at least $16,000, sometimes even $18,000 per year per robot. Okay, so it's a high or a big variable for us to pay attention to. The number of robots needed compared to what we're milking with now, the years of useful life is kind of a critical one as well, because when you take a look at technology, it's changing, there's updates, there's costs to that. There's a robot going to last 15, 17 years. Okay, again, a big impact on the profitability of it. The value of the robot after its useful life, so the more you put a higher number of years, the value of that robot is going to be lower and lower. Some people project that these robots might not be worth much at all after 13 or 15 years of a useful life, because again, technology just changes that much. The interest rate on money, the insurance per $1,000 of value, and we have had robot systems that have actually burnt down, so you want to make sure you're insuring it. So when we take a look at repair cost, based on our surveys, you can see the max versus the minimum. The average was 75.08. So if I'm a betting person looking at my budget, I'm probably going to put in that $9,000 a year or something like that. Milk house supplies, teat dip before and teat dip after. Some people are actually really surprised at how much teat dip they actually have gone before. We had one producer that actually had a pretty good record of his teat dip usage and actually said that there's about $1,000 a year per robot more. For using the T-tip and the robot compared to his previous system, but he was very judicious in his use of T-dip before. So now we're going to some other changes that we have. So the current out labor hours before the robot goes in. So taking a look at our current system versus what's going to happen afterwards at the 5.3 hours. You can see these ranges off to the right side. Hours of heat detection before and after, the labor rate for milking and heat detection, and the hours going into records management, the reduced labor hours, and the labor rate for records and labor management. So the labor in total just are big variables for us to take a look at because when you take a look at the time value of money, so what labor is worth today versus what labor is going to be worth in 15 years. And so how do you take a happy medium of what labor might be worth 7 years down the road, kind of as an average to take a look at, because that labor is actually going to be a very important variable to look at the profitability of the robot itself. So pounds of milk per cow per day, the projected milk change. So here they're looking at about a 10% increase in milk production. And so we've had some very high herd averages and some mediocre herd averages. So that have actually gained some pretty good milk production. So typically I'm going to say that your milk production is probably going to change somewhere between 5 and 15%. For those that are at 3 times a day milking, it's probably not going to change as much. And sometimes it might actually go down because we're not dealing with a true 3 time a day milking. For those that are 2 time a day, so typically it's going to go up at least somewhat. Some people, when they take a look at the difference of building a brand new building, so if you build a brand new freestall barn, I will almost guarantee milk production increases for most people in that 6 to 8% range. Okay, so when you put in the robot, it might be another 3 to 5% on top of that. And quite often, everybody gives the credit to the robot. Okay, so I'm just going to challenge you on that a little bit. If you're building new, I'm going to give at least that much credit to the freestall barn that was built new compared to the antiquated facilities we might have been working in to begin with. Okay, but we have had producers in Iowa that have had 25% increases in milk production, okay, without changing too much of anything and without even building new. So somatic cell counts will tend to go down a little bit over time. But we haven't been having some somatic cell count problems in the state of Iowa with the robots. When you take a look at the reproduction herd health software, there's a place where you can actually put a value in of what that's going to mean, the ease of keeping records and things like that. But I have been challenged that that's going to end up in the bulk tank at some point in time. So maybe that's not a true measure to actually put in. So kind of take that one with a little bit of a grain of salt. Feed costs are going to change. So knowing the pounds of TMR dry matter per pound of milk and what that cost is. And so when we take a look at changes, and we've got some farms here in Iowa that are feeding both a robotic milking system and also a conventional milking system, and they've got these two herds together, are actually in separate barns, but they're actually with the same nutritionist, and they're telling us there's only about a half of a cent per pound of dry matter difference between that ration on the robotic milking, which is a little bit higher than the conventional ration. So cull rates tend to come down a little bit. So that cost of replacement heifers, the cull price, okay, so the expected change in what you're going to use as culling reasons will probably change because you're going to be a lot more interested in feet and legs and maybe some udder conformation and things like that. But the cull rates actually tend to come down just a tad little bit with robotic milking. The changes in utilities, water costs, chemicals, that is so variable for every farm just because there's so many different ways of efficiency of water use and electrical uses on some of these farms that, again, take these numbers with a grain of salt here. So when we take all those variables and we put them into this partial budget, so on the left side, we have our positive impacts. The right side, we have our negative impacts. Okay, so on the positive impacts, we have increased incomes and decreased expenses. So you can see the milk production, again, it's a yellow background. So we know that that's an extremely important part. So we projected about a 10% increase in milk production, increase in milk premiums because somatic cell count went down, a negative increased cow sales because the cow sales actually went down. Okay, so the software value to the herd, we put in about $10,000 for a total increased incomes of about $119,455. So when we take a look at decreased expenses, so we have decreased heat detection, which is some labor. We also have reduced milking labor, that $44,457, reduced labor management because we don't have maybe as many employees, but we're still fixing things and So a total decreased expenses of 54,714 gives us total positive impacts of 174,169. So then we go over to the right side and we take a look at the capital recovery cost. Okay, so when we take a look at capital recovery costs, it's depreciation and interest. So purchase price minus salvage value gives us a value. And then we take a depreciation and interest cost on top of that over the 15 years, and that's 84,250. Okay, so that's not what we're going to pay the bank. That's just what the profit side of things. The increased repair and insurance costs, the increased feed costs, and people are getting surprised about how much those increased feed costs actually play into this. Increased cow replacement costs, increased utilities, supplies, records management. So the total increased expenses of 172,000. No decreased incomes we can think of. So net annual financial impact here is $1,472. Okay, so by putting in these 3 robots compared to the system that we're currently milking in, it's going to show it's going to be pretty much a break even. Okay, so you're not going to kind of gain financially, you're not going to lose. But if that quality of life means anything to you, and here we put in $15,000, that's going to up the ante to $16,472. So profit-wise, we can say that this is probably a pretty good deal for this robot compared to what they were working with. But again, that's a big caution, what you compare this thing to in this partial budget. So that's the profit. Now we need to think about the cash flow, because we amortized or we depreciated this out over 15 years, but now the bank wants us to pay this thing back in 7. Okay, so at 5.5% interest and how much the principal is on the loan, our total payment is 116,000. So we remember the 84,250, which is our depreciation, but the bank wants it all back here within 7 years. So our annual payment cash flow wise is actually going to be 116,397. So the cash flow difference itself is going to be 32,147 compared to the profit versus the cash flow mode that we're in here now, because the bank wants to get paid. So again, it's important to remember this is only for the first 7 years, because after 7 years, now we have the thing paid for, and now we get free labor for the next 8 years. It doesn't have to be accounted for in this cash flow. So heat detection, milking labor saved. Okay, so we are actually hiring only 35,000 of that, but now we actually are having this robot do this. So we actually need to come up with another $11,000 worth of cash to pay for some labor that we weren't even paying for to begin with. And then labor and records management changes at 2628. So we have a total change in AMS, automatic milking system, cash flow of a negative 42,000. So even though it was positive profit-wise by that 1,400 something, now it's actually negative by 42,000 in cash flow for the 3 robots. So again, does this pan out financially? It really depends. Are you talking cash flow? Or are you talking profitability? So when we take a look at payback systems, a lot of these things can actually pay back in 5 to 10 years. So we usually don't have a lot of payback issues with them unless we don't get the milk out of the robots. And so any robot that's getting 4,500 to 6,000 pounds per milk per day out of the robots, they tend to pan out actually quite well. Okay, if we're only getting 3,000 pounds of milk out of the robot, and comparing it to an efficient system, it probably isn't going to pan out too well if our previous system was milking 64 to 75 cows to the hour, like this low-cost milking parlor was. So payback periods, again, we can get those in pretty reasonable stages. But as we summarize this, labor is undoubtedly the key reason that people install the robotic milking. Okay, so yeah, there's cash flow issues. Typically, profit can be kind of a hit and miss depending on the farm. But studies have shown AMS to actually be less profitable than parlors, coming from my colleague Jim Salfer in Minnesota, or most other milking systems. But it's depending on a lot of variables that they're going to work with. And again, the key one is, what are you comparing it to begin with? So milk production, Minnesota increased by 9.3%, Iowa about 12%. Okay, so we're definitely getting milk production increases. But again, for those that actually remodel everything with the freestall barn in 2017, we actually saw a 17% increase in milk production. Okay, so again, what percent gain do you give to the robot? What gain do you give to the new construction? So labor wages, savings, efficiency. Okay, so now we can start taking a look at people getting 2.2 million pounds of milk. We've got some robot operations that are starting to push 3 million pounds of milk. The years of useful life, the repair costs, again, is kind of a caution. In number 7 there, milking 12% more cows with 75% less labor. In 2012, the survey said. In 2017, milking 33% more cows with 55% less milking labor. Okay, so the bottom line is that cows like them. People tend to like them, okay, but that's not, we have had some that were not satisfied with them and they actually pulled them out. But for the ones that kept them in, they were actually quite satisfied with them. So again, robotic milking, just some simple thoughts on the economics of it. Again, make sure we're dealing with the cash flow versus the profitability. And when you're building new, does all that credit go to the robot? I tend to say at least 5 to 8% of that goes to the new freestall building. So with that, with all the products that I used in there, no endorsement of any products were intended. So appreciate the listening.
Hi, this is Jim Salfer with the University of Minnesota Extension out of St. Cloud. And today I'm going to spend some time talking about feeding and management for robotic milking success. My agenda today kind of is I'm going to talk about the keys for robotic milking success, and I'm going to be using information both from our research trials that we've run and also just observation and interacting with robotic producers. So first of all, one of the most important things for robotic milking success is to really have excellent feed management. This is information we did from a survey a number of years ago from both farmers and their nutritionists. And so maybe not surprising, the number one reason was really feed management. And we described that as consistent feeding, consistent mixing, consistent moisture. So all the things around feeding management, not so much moisture or ration formulation, and then pellet palatability and quality rank second. And I think part of the reason for that is once most farms get a pellet that really works well for them, they tend to focus on feed management issues. So I'm going to run through a cascade here of some of the things that I think are really key to robotic success. A lot of this is going to be the same, whether it's a conventional dairy or a robotic dairy, but I think many of these steps are actually more important in a robotic dairy because we've got to have cows that are willing to move, stay active, and attend the robot on their own. So first of all, it's important to have excellent pre-calving management because what that really does is promote high post-calving intake. If we've got those high post-calving intakes, that promotes really healthy fresh cows and cows that feel good. And when they feel good, they're likely to be up, they're likely to moving around versus a cow that might not feel good and just lay in her stall. But those healthy fresh cows also promote high early lactation visits. That promotes high early lactation milk production. That high early lactation milk production drives feed intake at the bunk. When we get high feed intake at the bunk, that drives high milk production, which also drives more PMR intake. So you can see we kind of create a circle here, right through here. So if we can get these cows off to a good start, they're healthy, they're eating, they're active, they're visiting, we really are setting these cows up for success. And again, we get high PMR intake, drives production, drives milk production, and ultimately we get our goal, which is high visits, high milk production, high intake, and a healthy herd. So what are some of the specific feeding recommendations? So again, ultimately you'll hear a theme here. We want diets and management that really promote good cow flow and healthy cows that are willing to move around. Pre-calving management, most of us know this, nothing unique to robots. We want 80 to 90% of free stock stocking density, and we want to have plenty of bunk space. And again, I'd just like to emphasize, I think this is even more important in robotic dairies because in a conventional dairy, we spend a lot of time with these fresh cows, babying them, chasing them up, maybe taking temperatures, and we force them to be milked. Here, we want these cows really healthy. A high quality forage in the PMR. I don't think we've really emphasized this nearly enough on robotic dairies. We often talk about the pellet and the pellet quality and what's in the pellet. But if we can put up really high quality forage, that allows us to feed a high energy diet without a lot of starch in the PMR. That helps keep cows healthy, and it also helps them feeling good, ruminating, and so they're more likely to be up and around and visiting the robot. And then make sure we monitor forage moisture and adjust the diet because, of course, then the diet isn't exactly as a nutritionist formulated. The other thing, we need to focus on a PMR that supports high milk production. We want consistent feed quality and quantity across the bunk. We want all of the cows, no matter when she comes up to eat that PMR, to get exactly the same diet. because if one cow tends to go up first, she tends to get a lot of grain. She may be a little subclinical acidosis. She might not feel quite as good. So she may go lay down because her stomach hurts, maybe not visit the robot. Our cows that come up later might end up with a lot more forages. And so then they don't get the energy they need out of that PMR. So again, I think it's more important, this feeding management, than it may be even in a conventional dairy. Again, I talked about this earlier. We want diets that keep cows active and feeling good, that really promotes good cow flow. And we want management that enhances rest and rumination. So cows that aren't standing around, loitering around in the aisles, we want them that they're going to lay down, so that keeps the aisles clean for cows that want to visit the robot or want to eat. Another thing that, of course, is a success is we want high milk per cow and high milk per robot. And in order to achieve that, we really do need high early lactation visits, because high early lactation visits really promotes high early lactation milk production, which carries over into the rest of the lactation. And our research has shown that high milk per cow is correlated with high milk per robot. Again, nothing real surprising there. This is just a slide from Mike Brook looking at a herd and kind of the breakdown. I think you could pick any herd or even a group of herds and you'd kind of have the same information. But if you look at it, you can see these are 2-year-olds only. I've got the information for older cows, but the information basically looks the same. But you can see these early lactation cows that are only visiting a couple of times a day. They're milking about 50 pounds. If we can get these cows to visit a lot oftener, they're likely to have a lot higher early milk production. And you can see that equates to higher milk production and more visits a little bit later in their lactation. This is from a couple of different research projects that we've done over the years, looking at what we found out are factors that influence milk per robot. And you can see, not too surprising, just the number of milking visits to the robot in a day really makes a difference. That seems pretty logical. Milking speed and cows per robot unit. And of course, these top three are the biggest influence, but they're also somewhat all interrelated. If we have more visits to the robot, the way to get that is how to have a higher, faster milking speed. And of course, if we put more cows on the robot, fast milking cows, we're going to tend to get more milking visits per day. Some of the other items we picked up is automatic alley scraper in our latest research project, robot feed. And now I might be able to argue these are associations, so it's not a direct cause and effect. And so I could make an argument cows that milk more or people that higher producing cows tend to feed more robot feed just because their cows milk better. Multiple feeds through the robot. I think we're one of the first groups that really has looked at that. And we did pick up that the farms that fed more than one feed through their robot did have a little higher production per robot. And automatic feed pushers. We picked that up in all of our studies that if you had an automatic feed pusher, you got more milk per cow and more milk per robot. Some of the things that negatively affected milk per robot is residual feed. And that was feed that the cows were programmed through the computer to receive, but they actually didn't receive that feed. It isn't how much feed they fed. We don't really know how to measure that, but it's feed that the cow should have received when she went into the robot box, but she did not get offered. Failed visits, farms that had more failed visits per cow had lower milk production. Refused visits or refusals, cows with higher refusals had a little lower milk. And then we did pick up robots per pen, but I wouldn't hang my hat on that because there's other research studies that have shown that 2 or 3 robots per pen actually achieved a little higher milk production. Some herds, first lactation cows kind of struggle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what we've at least seen. This was a project, kind of a retrospective study looking back on a particular farm that during a year's period of time, they did not pre-train their heifers. And then they did a slight expansion and they had their close-up heifers right next to a robot. And so they decided that they would chase the heifers through the robot box, not milk them or anything, just offer them a little bit of feed and walk them through the robot milking box. And that would be the yellow bars or kind of the golden bars. And you can see that by 15 days in milk, or by the time they were fresh, 2 to 3 weeks, these heifers were nearly visiting 3 times per day once they were trained. If you look across the maroon bars, they never achieved that level. As a matter of fact, the highest they achieved was about 2.5 times per day. And you see for much of their lactation, they were over 3 times per day. So just about a half a visit per cow per day more, or some periods actually more than a visit per cow per day more. So I think there really is a lot of discussion now. Is there something we can do to kind of pre-train these heifers? And farmers are doing all kinds of activities. Some are putting not robots in their close-up pens, but they're putting something that looks like a robot, maybe feeding some pellet feed through there. There's not really very many farms that are doing what this particular farm does, but I think it's worth us all pondering and thinking about how can we get those heifers in particular used to walking into a box, being delivered some feed, some of those activities that are really all new and foreign to them. Some points to ponder, and these are from questions that I really get a lot as I work with farms. How many fetch cows should I have? What's kind of a normal average number? And what is the best way to train heifers? And it seems like there's 2 schools of thoughts among farmers. I'm going to kind of force them. So I'm going to maybe chase them or train them for a week or 2. And then at some point, I'm going to leave them go quite a while before I fetch them. And hopefully they'll start going on their own. Or there's other farms that say, I really want to train them and I want to fetch them at least 3 times per day. First of all, I'll answer the first question on number of fetch cows. And I think we really need to break our fetch cows up in different groups. We think about training fresh heifers or teaching fresh heifers, these unexpected cows. So that might be a cow that's in heat one day, something like that, where it's just a real unusual situation. One time she's a fetch cow and then she's not a fetch cow again. We've got these late lactation, low producing cows. I would argue there's maybe not a lot we can do about those. That's the way cows tend to get when they get long days in milk and they're not producing very well. These 2 boxes I've highlighted in red are really the concerns and what I would call true fetch cows. These are your sick or lame cows that might not be coming to the robot consistently. And then we've got, these are really the struggling ones. We've got these early and mid lactation cows that just don't come to the robot. And those are the ones I think we really need to try to strategize around. These up here, again, I wouldn't even call training a fresh heifer a fetch cow. I think that's a cow in training. In reality, she's not, we're fetching her, but think of her as a training cow. So let's think a little bit about this. Again, I don't even like to use the term fetching a heifer. You can see up here, we're teaching our heifers. We're not fetching them, we're teaching them. And it's important that we, just like when we're teaching children or teaching our dog, we want them to practice a behavior. You want them to learn. And as I mentioned earlier, we want high visits early. Hopefully that equates to high visits late, and it'll equate to high milk production. So we need to think about these differently, and I think we need to treat them differently than a mid-lactation fetch cow or a lame fetch cow, where we're just going to go into that pen and chase her to the robot because she should know better. These don't know better. We're training them. So for the first couple of days, I think it's important to teach them about that entire pen, kind of walk them around where the waters are. Part of it is you're just getting them used to what they're supposed to do and how to interact. And then I think we do kind of our typical morning and evening fetching. But I think we need to be a little tricky about it and be a little stealthy and not let them know that we're fetching them. And then I would encourage you, for these heifers in particular, maybe once or twice in between. We're likely to be in the barn anyway. And I think we don't want to do that at the same time of day. So every time at noon, we're going to do it. I think kind of mix that up a little bit. Move slow. Again, don't chase them. One of the big concerns farms have is I'm going to teach these cows that when I come in the pen, that they're going to go to the robot. I think we need to consciously think about that, because I think that is true. So I think just going in and chasing them to the robot, they really do have a tendency to maybe become chronic fetchers. So the key is to guide them to the robot and be a little stealthy and not let them know you're doing that. I know this is going to take more time. There's no doubt it's going to take more time, but I think if we can get those heifers trained really well in early lactation, it'll result in higher visits, higher milk production, and less fetching later. A couple other points to ponder. What's the right number of milkings per cow per day? Get that question an awful lot. And what's the right number of cows per robot? And I think, of course, this is what maximizes robot productivity. And I like to respond to producers that ask me that question. I say, what is your goal? I'm not sure there's a right answer for every farm. And I think milk production makes a difference. And I'll show some of our data. I think if you're a large crop farmer and you've got a dairy enterprise, and so you're spending a lot of time in the field and you're busy with a lot of different enterprises and you don't have somebody really dedicated, you're kind of short of labor, you're likely to want more free time in case a robot breaks down or cows to attend the robot. You want to minimize the number of fetch cows. You're going to have less cows per robot. If you're really in the barn a lot, you love cows, you don't mind interacting with your cows. Your goal is to maximize robot productivity. You want less free time. You're going to be able to allow to put more cows on that robot. And also you're likely to maybe get a few more milkings per cow. This is some of our data. First of all, I'd like to really preface this by saying that we didn't find really any statistical significance. This is more for what farms are doing. And you see on the bottom, there's a lot of farms. This is the number of herds that fell in this category. So most of the herds, not surprisingly, average between 50 and 60 cows per robot. And this is data over an entire year. So it's not a week's worth of data, or it's not that we took information off their dashboard when we went there. You can see we had some farms at the peripheral here, but you can see what kind of happened. Not surprising, this is the maroon bars are the number of milkings per cow per day. And that peaked about 2.9 at 55 to 60 cows per robot. And that's typically, I think, what you hear in the industry. Here's what happened to free time. Of course, again, not surprising, the number of people that had fewer number of cows per robot had more free time. And as they got here, the amount of free time dropped. But you can see there's clearly a few farms that were able to, or at least their choice was to have 65 to 70 cows per robot. And again, this was an average over a year. They only achieved 2.6 milkings per cow per day. So how did that equate to milk production? So my next slide here. So you can see, interestingly, I think surprising for a lot of people, the highest, again, not statistical, not a lot of difference here, but there's clearly some herds out here that are able to achieve high production per cow, very high production per robot. Remember, this is an average number across all the robots for over a year, and with a lot of cows. Now, you're not going to do this the first year you're in a robot barn. You're not likely to do it the second year you're in a robot barn. You're going to have to be in a number of years. You've got to have the right kind of cows. You've got to have the right permission settings. And most of these farms will openly admit that they probably are fetching more cows than maybe some farmers would desire. So I'm sure not advocating or promoting that's the right number. I'm just saying with the right management, if that's your goal, there are farms that are able to achieve some of those numbers. This is our guided flow barn. We don't have near as many guided flow facilities in our database, but I thought I'd show it. So each of these bars is a line, so you don't see kind of the pattern. Each of these lines is a farm. So you can see we only had 9 farms in our database. You can see the cow numbers went from 58, and we actually had one farm up to 77. You can see the average milkings per cow on these farms, a little bit lower than the guided flow farms, but they also really control a little bit more on how the cows come in. But you can see just really no real strong pattern across that. Let's look at milk production per cow, and also, again, milk production per robot. And if you look across this, again, you don't see a real strong pattern. Here's a farm on the end that actually was able to achieve about an 85-pound tank average, or 85 pounds of milk per cow per day, with 77 cows and about 5,500 pounds of milk per robot. Not a real pattern. You can see we actually had a farm down here, about 60 cows that were averaging 104. Not a pattern, but my only point of showing this up here is that there is a fairly wide range, and I don't think it's really settled upon. The other thing I'd like to mention is the newer models of robots and newer generations clearly seem like they can milk more cows because they just attach faster, they milk faster, the settings are better. And I think we're going to continue to see that. So I wouldn't be surprised as we go ahead if 65 to 70 cows or even more than that per robot become a much more of a commonplace. I think part of that has to do with getting the right milking access settings. I'm not sure what the right number is, but I think we really strategically need to think about milk access settings. I only put this screenshot up here on the bottom is I think this is one good way, I think, to think about what we want for an average amount of milk every time a cow comes in. This particular farm, you can see here, it's about 40 pounds that is dumped out of an udder every time a cow comes in. Is that the right number? I'm not sure. I think for 2-year-olds, it might be a little bit high, but I think that's the right mindset. I'm not touting that this is the right answer. I think it's the right mindset as how much milk do I want a cow to give every time she comes in? Because a low producing cow that comes in and her udder's not full takes about the same amount of time to prep that cow and get her in and out of the robot. So one of the other things I'd like to talk about, if there's listeners that don't have robots, is you really have to get a mindset of dealing with the imperfections of robots. Some of the things they don't do, and they're getting better again, the new models of robots are better, but as a rule, they're not the best at prepping and dipping all the time. You might have to dealing with chapped teats in the winter. How do we do that? Dealing with milk quality and mastitis, that's not an issue if you've got a really low somatic cell count, but if you've got Staph aureus or another contagious organisms, it's a lot harder because we're going to tend to not to sort those in groups. So just identifying mastitis and dealing with Staph aureus. This can create some frustration for people. Some cows just don't read the book and don't behave like you'd like they're real high producing cows, and by golly, they're going to go through that robot twice. That's just all they're going to do. And then training heifers, as we talked about, can be kind of a pain. Here's just an example. This is a picture I took on a farm. You can see the teat dip did a nice job of disinfecting the udder, but maybe not so good on the teats. This other camera is just a picture that it just couldn't identify the teat, so it's actually prepped the side of the udder. Here's another one, and I get enough of these calls that I thought I'd put it up here and talk about it. This looks like a really nice udder for a robot. And we happened to be there on one of our projects, and the farmer said, yeah, cow fails pretty often. And the reason is, if you look at this back right quarter, it's a little bit lighter. And I have this discussion a lot. Farmers will move in and they're frustrated. They think their robot's not working quite correctly. And of course, you can milk these cows in a parlor, okay, but I guess don't be surprised if you have cows that look like they should have a pretty nice udder, but one of the quarters maybe is a little bit light, and the robot tends to have a hard time in this particular farm on this particular cow. What it tended to do is attach to the side of the teat. So it's not that it couldn't find the teat, it just had a hard time attaching to it. So kind of in summary, it's really important to have high production per cow and per robot. To get that, we need high visits, early lactation. I talked about that. Well-balanced diets, excellent transition programs. The same things you need in a high parlor herd. High reproductive efficiency, maybe even more important so we don't get those late lactation cows. Excellent cow comfort, and really a low somatic cell count. We need to optimize box time. So we want cows that attach fast, cows that milk fast, and really carefully thought out milking permissions. And we may increase the number of fetch cows in a free flow system if we have too many cows per robot. Kind of summary again, labor, cost, and availability is going to continue to be a challenge. Of course, that's why many people are putting in robots. It really does require excellent management. I would argue probably better management than it takes in a parlor situation. We need an excellent transition program. I mentioned that already. And I think it's important to help the robot succeed. Get a good dealer, really think about those feed and access table, get the correct employees that know how to read your computer screen, our correct mindset and management, use all the data that's available. We need good barn design. We need good robot maintenance. We need really good cleanliness, select the right kind of cows, keep the udders trimmed up. And I think you're much more likely to have success. And then think about it as a whole system, not just plopping robots in a barn. This is an entire new milking system that you need to think about. So, and then make sure the cash flow works. So that's it. If you have some questions, feel free to give me a call. My contact information is at the bottom of the slide, and we'll take questions later.
Okay, we will move into the Q&A session here. Got a few questions that have come into the chat box. So the first question for Larry. Larry, I don't know if you're on, if you can go ahead and unmute, but do you see any trends with herd size in relation to adoption of AMS? You know, or is it mostly small herds, or are you seeing kind of a mix of small and large herds that are adopting AMS?
I would tend to say that there's a good mix. And I think early on when they first came to be, we kind of really thought that this is kind of a 1, 2, 3 robot type technology for your smaller farms, 180 cows and less. And so I think as just in the last, 3 to 5 years, we've seen some of the bigger herds in Iowa actually, switch to it. So we've got herds that, in that 6, 8, sometimes even 10, 12 robots that are on a herd. So I think the mix has really gotten, and I think the big issue is just labor availability has, I think, really exacerbated the propensity of people to put these in. And so I think that's definitely a big piece of it. But yeah, I say what I used to think of as a small farm technology, I think is definitely being applied all the way across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I just want to remind people, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box. And we've got a few minutes here yet to cover questions. Also, just want to remind people, we will have our 4th and final webinar on the Dairy Technology Series on May 6th from noon to 1:15. And that's going to feature Dr. Gail Carpenter, as well as Jen Bentley, our Extension Dairy Specialist. And they'll be talking about automatic calf feeder management. And then I'll be covering some facility design considerations for group housing of calves. Again, that will be on May 6th from noon to 1:15.
And Brian, I just have one question for you. In your regards to your facilities and around the robot room, any recommendations for heat abatement strategies, more additional fans? What is kind of the recommendations there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So probably a good thing to do there, once you have the facility in, is maybe use like a fogger or something to check your airflow patterns around that robot, just to see if you have any dead spots. So I mentioned the positive pressure tubes in the presentation there. That's a really good strategy if you just have a smaller area you need to target and get some fresh air to. So that would be one approach that you could use. You do need to be a little bit careful of ventilating the area right in front of the robot, because if you make that area too comfortable, or actually, cooler and more comfortable than the rest of the barn, you could actually have cows start congregating in front of the robot there, which you don't want to happen. It should be as comfortable as the rest of the barn, but not more so, because that could create more problems than you solve by putting in the ventilation. But you definitely want to keep those cows cool and comfortable while they're being milked as well. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. But I would definitely kind of assess airflow in that area and make sure it's as good as the rest of the facility. So I've got one more question for Larry here. Do you have any general tips, on the economic side for people making the transition to AMS? What are some of the pitfalls or mistakes that people tend to make, and what generally makes it successful?
Yeah, I think probably the over focus sometimes just on the cash flow, or the over focus sometimes just on the profitability of it, when those two really need to be kind of mixed together, because there is such a big difference with that. And so when people take a look at, just the costs of saving labor, they really tend to focus on that, but they don't realize all these other costs that might be going into it. And I think the other thing, that just kind of reiterate what I mentioned about, those big costs and that cash flow. I mean, for a lot of producers that are borrowing on a 7-year time frame for the robots, again, it's an issue for 7 years, and after that you pretty much have it paid for. So I think those are probably the 3 biggest things I would tend to say there, just to really take a look at. And that spreadsheet's available. I know Minnesota has a variation of that spreadsheet as well that's very useful, that actually takes into account the time value of money and the time value of what labor is going to be. And so when you take a look at these labor costs, we're just not dealing with today's dollars. We're actually dealing with what's that average cost of labor going to be for the next 15 years. And as milk prices go higher or lower, it has a big impact, but those labor costs have an extremely big impact on the profitability of the robots.
Great, thanks, Larry. So don't see any more questions in the chat box there. We are right at 1:15, so I just want to thank everyone for joining today. Again, be sure to tune in to our next webinar on May 6th from noon to 1:15 p.m. and we will conclude the program. Thanks for watching.